The platinum band hit the cold marble floor with a sharp, metallic ring. It bounced twice before rolling to a stop against the toe of her worn, vintage shoe. Pierce did not even look down. He simply stared at her with eyes as cold as a Silicon Valley winter, his voice carrying perfectly to the very back of the Gothic chapel. He told her she was a public relations disaster. He told her she was a charity case who did not belong in his world. The words hung in the air, freezing the warmth in her chest. Sloane felt the eyes of 300 guests boring into her back. These were the elite of the elite. The people who ruled Manhattan and Silicon Valley from high-rise penthouses and private jets. They did not look away. They did not whisper in shock. They simply watched with the detached curiosity of spectators at a Roman arena. To them, her public execution was just another form of entertainment. The chapel itself seemed to conspire against her. The towering limestone walls, imported from a quarry in southern France, rose up to meet a vaulted ceiling that was lost in shadow. The scent of thousands of white lilies, flown in from Ecuador that morning, was thick and suffocating. Mixing with the expensive perfumes of the women in the pews, every detail of this space had been designed to project absolute, untouchable wealth. And in the center of it all stood Sloane, wearing a dress that cost less than the champagne being chilled for the reception. Sloane looked down at her hands, which were trembling against the ivory silk of her gown. The dress was old, dating back to the late 1970s. It had belonged to her mother, Caroline, and Sloane had spent months carefully restoring the delicate lace by hand. There were no designer labels sewn into the seams. There were no diamonds encrusted along the neckline. In a room filled with custom Vera Wang and Chanel couture, her dress looked like a relic from a forgotten era. Pierce had made his disgust clear from the moment he saw her at the altar. He had leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and mints, and whispered that she looked like a peasant. He had told her that his mother was mortified. He had told her that the photographers from the major business magazines were outside, and he could not let them see him marrying a woman who looked like she had scavenged her gown from a thrift store. Sloane remembered the promises he had made when they first met in the quiet archives of the university. He had seemed so different then, so interested in her work, so appreciative of her quiet life. He had told her that he was tired of the shallow, transactional nature of his social circle. He had told her that her simplicity was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. But that was before his hedge fund had grown into a multi-billion-dollar empire. That was before he became the golden boy of the tech sector, featured on the covers of every major financial publication. As his wealth grew, his need for validation grew with it. He no longer saw Sloane as a refuge from his world. He saw her as a liability, a quiet reminder of a life he wanted to leave behind. His mother, Vivienne, had been the architect of this shift. Vivienne sat in the very front pew, her hands folded over her Hermes clutch. Her face was a masterpiece of modern dermatology, completely smooth and devoid of any human emotion. She had spent the last 6 months trying to break Sloane's spirit. She had organized seating arrangements that left Sloane's few friends in the back corners of the room. She had ordered the caterers to ignore Sloane's requests for a simple local menu, replacing it with imported caviar and gold leaf desserts. Now, as her son delivered the final blow, Vivienne did not hide her satisfaction. She leaned toward her companion, a wealthy real estate heiress, and murmured that some people simply did not have the blood for this life. She had always known Sloane was a mistake. She had wanted Pierce to marry the daughter of a European shipping magnate, a woman who understood the language of power and leverage. Today, she was finally getting her wish. Sloane turned her head slightly, her eyes searching the back of the chapel. She found her father standing near the heavy oak doors. He was wearing his work clothes, a faded canvas jacket and heavy boots that were stained with the dark soil of the estate grounds. He had spent the morning clearing the gravel paths so the guests' luxury sedans would not get dirty. He looked so small, so out of place among the towering stone pillars and the stained glass windows. Sloane's heart ached with a fierce, protective pain. She had begged Pierce to let her father sit in the front row, to let him walk her down the aisle. But Pierce had laughed in her face. He had told her that a man who smelled of fertilizer and gasoline had no business standing near the altar. He had threatened to cancel the wedding if Arthur tried to play the part of the proud father. To protect her father from further humiliation, Sloane had agreed to walk down the aisle alone. And now, Her father was forced to watch his daughter be discarded in front of the very people he served. Sloane remembered the sacrifices her father had made for her. They had lived in a drafty cottage on the edge of the estate for as long as she could remember. Her father had worked 12 hours a day, his hands always calloused, his back always aching. Yet, he had never complained. He had saved every penny to send her to a good school, to ensure she had a future. She had always believed he was just a simple, humble man who loved the earth and his daughter. She had felt so much guilt for bringing him into Pierce's orbit, for exposing him to the cruel condescension of the wealthy. Pierce took a step back, his hands sliding into the pockets of his trousers. He spoke loudly enough for his voice to echo off the high vaulted ceiling. He told her that he was doing her a favor. He said that she would never survive the pressure of his world. He said that his mother had tried to help her, but Sloane was simply too stubborn, too unrefined. He told her that a marriage was a partnership of equals, and she had nothing to offer. He pointed toward the back of the chapel, toward her father. He told her that she belonged in the dirt with him, not in a penthouse overlooking Central Park. The guests in the pews chuckled softly. Apolite. Rustling sound like dry leaves in the wind. They agreed with him. In their world, poverty was a moral failing, and simplicity was a sign of weakness. They looked at Sloane with a mixture of pity and disgust. Sloane stood perfectly still. She did not cry. She did not beg. She felt a strange, cold sensation washing over her. A sudden and absolute clarity. She looked at Pierce's handsome, symmetrical face and realized that she had never actually known him. She had loved a ghost. A carefully constructed public relations persona designed to attract investors. The real Pierce was a small, frightened boy who was terrified of his mother and obsessed with his bank account. But before she could speak, a sound broke the silence of the chapel. It was a heavy, wooden thud. Everyone turned to look toward the back of the room. Arthur had placed his mop against the stone wall. He was no longer leaning against the pillar. He was standing at his full height. For 25 years, Arthur had walked with a slight slouch, his head bowed, his eyes always fixed on the ground. He had lived as an invisible man, a ghost who moved through the gardens and the hallways without leaving a trace. But now, as he stood in the center of the aisle, his posture changed. The slouch vanished. His chest expanded, and his head lifted. The air in the chapel seemed to grow cold, the temperature dropping in an instant. There was a sudden, heavy stillness that settled over the room, a physical pressure that made it difficult to breathe. The guests, who had been whispering and smiling a moment before, fell silent. They watched as the groundskeeper began to walk down the center aisle. He did not walk like a servant. He walked with a slow, measured stride that carried the weight of absolute authority. His heavy work boots clicked against the marble floor, a rhythmic, echoing sound that sounded like a countdown. The security guards at the back of the chapel took a step forward, their hands moving toward their jackets, but Arthur did not even look at them. He kept his eyes locked on the altar, his face a mask of cold, unyielding stone. As he passed the pews, the guest shrank back, instinctively giving him space. There was something terrifying about his presence. Araf. Elemental power that made their expensive suits and designer dresses feel like cheap paper. Pierce watched him approach, his face twisting into a sneer. He took a step forward, his voice dripping with condescension. He told Arthur to stop right there. He told him that he had no right to walk on the custom silk runner. He threatened to have his security team throw him out of the chapel and off the estate. He told him that he was fired, effective immediately, and that he would not receive a single penny of severance. But Arthur did not stop. He did not even look at Pierce. His eyes were fixed on Sloane, his expression filled with a deep, ancient sadness and an unbreakable resolve. When he reached the altar, he stood between Sloane and Pierce. He was a head taller than the younger man, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow over the groom. Arthur raised his hand, his fingers making a small, precise gesture toward the back of the chapel. From the shadows near the entrance, a man in a flawless, charcoal gray suit stood up. He was carrying a bespoke leather briefcase, his movements smooth and deliberate. As he walked down the aisle, several of the older men in the pews gasped. These were men who had spent their entire lives in the highest corridors of financial power. And they recognized him instantly. His name was Harrison. He was not a lawyer who handled divorces or contract disputes. He was the chief legal counsel for the Sterling Group, a multi-billion-dollar global conglomerate that had not been active in public markets for 2 decades. Harrison was a man who only appeared when empires were about to be built or destroyed. He walked straight to Arthur, stopped, and bowed his head in a gesture of profound respect. He opened the briefcase, pulled out a thick stack of notarized documents, and handed them to the older man. Arthur took the papers, his calloused fingers turning the pages with a familiar ease. He looked at Pierce, his eyes cold and empty. When he spoke, his voice was no longer the quiet, gravelly murmur of a groundskeeper. It was a deep, resonant baritone that filled every corner of the high Gothic chapel. He asked Pierce if he truly believed that wealth was measured by the name on a building or the label on a suit. He asked Pierce if he knew who actually owned the land beneath his feet. Pierce laughed, a high, nervous sound that betrayed his sudden fear. He told Arthur that he was insane, that his family had owned this estate for 15 years. Arthur shook his head slowly. He told Pierce that his family had been leasing this estate from a holding company. He told him that the holding company was owned by a trust, and he told him that he was the sole trustee of that trust. He looked at the guests in the pews, his chaise lingering on Vivienne. He introduced himself not as Arthur, the groundskeeper. He introduced himself as Alistair Sterling. The name echoed through the chapel like a physical blow. In the front row, Vivienne stood up so quickly, her chair scraped loudly against the stone floor. Her face was white, her eyes wide with a terror that she could not hide. She knew that name, 25 years ago. Alistair Sterling was the most powerful man on Wall Street, a titan of old money who could destroy a bank with a single phone call. And then, overnight, he had vanished. The world had assumed he was dead, or that he had fled the country to escape some hidden scandal. But Vivienne remembered him. She remembered him because, before she married into her current family, she had been a low-level secretary at a firm that handled his accounts. She had seen the documents. She knew the power he wielded, and she knew the secrets he carried. She looked at the man in the faded canvas jacket and realized, with a sickening jolt, that he had been watching her for years. Alistair looked down at the papers in his hand. He told the room that he had spent the last 2 years watching Pierce. He had wanted to see if the man his daughter loved was worthy of her. He had prepared a wedding gift. He held up the documents, showing the notary seals and the official stamps. It was a deed of transfer. It would have given Pierce and Sloane ownership of the entire Hudson Valley estate. It also contained a transfer of tech equity shares worth $500 million in the very fund Pierce was trying to close. Alistair looked Pierce in the eye. He told him that he had failed the test. With a slow, deliberate motion, Alistair tore the documents in half. The sound of the thick paper ripping was incredibly loud in the silent chapel. He tore them again, and again, until they were nothing but scraps of paper. He let them fall to the marble floor, landing right next to the discarded Cartier ring. He told Pierce that his venture capital fund would not be closing. He told him that the lead investors had already pulled out, acting on his orders. He told him that by tomorrow morning, his family's company would be bankrupt. Pierce's face went from pale to green. He looked at the shredded papers on the floor, then at Alistair, and finally at Sloane. The arrogance vanished from his posture, replaced by a desperate, pathetic panic. He took a step toward Sloane, his hands reaching out. He told her that he was sorry. He told her that he had been under so much pressure from his mother and the investors. He said that he didn't mean any of it. He said that he loved her, that the dress was beautiful, and that they could still get married right now. He begged her to talk to her father. He begged her to save his family. Sloane looked at him, and for the first time in her life, she felt absolutely nothing. The pain was gone, replaced by a cold, clear clarity. She looked at the man she had almost married and saw him for what he truly was, a coward, a parasite who fed on the status of others. She looked down at the Cartier ring on the floor. She stepped on it, her vintage shoe grinding the metal into the marble. She looked Pierce in the eye and told him that he was right about one thing. She did not belong in his world, but it was not because she was too small for it. It was because his world was too small for her. She turned her back on him. Before they could leave the altar, a voice called out from the back of the chapel. It was a raspy, trembling voice, but it carried a terrifying weight. An older woman stepped out from the shadows of the Gothic pillars. Her name was Martha. She had been the executive house manager for the Sterling estate decades ago. She had been in hiding for 25 years. Terrified of what Vivienne's family would do to her, she walked slowly toward the altar. Holding a small, rusted iron key in her hand, she looked at Alistair. Her eyes filled with tears and anger. She told him that he had hidden his daughter in poverty to protect her. She told him that he had built a wall of secrets to keep her safe. But she asked him if he had ever told Sloane the truth about her mother. She asked him if he had told her who had actually murdered Caroline. In the front row, Vivienne let out a sharp gasp and dropped her designer clutch, the contents spilling across the cold stone floor. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the breathing of the guests seemed to stop. Sloane turned slowly, her eyes moving from the trembling figure of Vivienne to her father's face, which had been so strong and resolute just a moment ago, suddenly looked pale and fragile. He looked at Martha, and then at Sloane, his lips parting but no sound coming out. Sloane felt a cold dread settling in her stomach, a feeling far worse than the humiliation Pierce had inflicted on her. She looked at the rusted key in Martha's hand. She asked her father what the woman was talking about. She asked him if her mother had not died of an illness, as he had told her for 25 years. Alistair did not answer. He looked down at the shredded documents at his feet, his shoulders slumping slightly. The illusion of his absolute power seemed to crack, revealing a deep, festering wound that had never healed. Vivienne was on her knees now, frantically trying to gather the contents of her purse. Her hands were shaking so violently that she dropped her lipstick, which rolled across the marble and stopped near the shredded paper. She did not look up. She did not say a word. But her silence was the loudest confession of all. Sloane took a step toward Martha, her heart hammering against her ribs. She asked her to tell her the truth. She asked her who had killed her mother. Martha looked at Vivienne, her eyes filled with a cold, vengeful satisfaction. She said that the people who had built their empire on Caroline's grave were sitting in the front row. She said that the accident in the Hamptons 25 years ago was no accident at all. It was a calculated execution, designed to steal Caroline's shares in the Sterling Group and launch a new dynasty. And she said that Vivienne had been the one who forged the documents to cover it up. Sloane felt the room spin. She looked at her father, her voice barely a whisper. She asked him if he had known this all along. She asked him if he had let her grow up in poverty, believing they were poor and helpless, while the people who murdered her mother lived in luxury on their land. Alistair finally looked up, his eyes filled with an agonizing pain. He told her that he had done it to keep her alive. He said that the people who killed Caroline would have killed Sloane too if they had known where she was. He said that he had to become a ghost to keep her safe. But Sloane did not feel safe. She felt betrayed. She looked at the man she had trusted more than anyone in the world and realized that her entire life had been a lie. She looked at Pierce, who was staring at his mother in horror. Realizing that his family's wealth was built on blood and forgery, she looked at the guests, who were now whispering in frantic, terrified tones. Realizing that they were witnesses to a corporate massacre, the chapel doors at the back of the room suddenly groaned. They began to swing open, letting in the cold, damp air of the Hudson Valley. The sound of heavy engines idling outside echoed through the stone hall. Sloane did not move. She stood in the center of the ruins of her wedding, caught between the father who had lied to protect her and the family that had destroyed her life before it had even begun. The word murder seemed to expand, filling the high, vaulted spaces of the chapel until the air itself felt too thick to breathe. Sloane stood frozen, her fingers clutching the delicate lace of her mother's vintage gown so tightly, her knuckles turned white. The whispers among the 300 guests died instantly, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed down on the room like a physical weight. In the front row, Vivienne Vance looked as though she had been struck by lightning. Her perfectly applied makeup could not hide the sudden gray pallor of her skin, and her hand remained frozen in midair. Inches from the spilled contents of her designer clutch, Pierce looked between his mother and the older woman, Martha, his face twisting with a mixture of confusion and growing panic. He demanded to know what kind of sick game this was. his voice cracking as he tried to maintain his usual air of absolute authority. He pointed a trembling finger at Martha, calling her a liar and demanding that security drag her out of the building immediately. But the security guards did not move. They stood near the heavy oak doors, their eyes fixed on Harrison, the elite corporate attorney who had accompanied Alistair down the aisle. Harrison simply stood there, his face a mask of professional indifference, his hands folded over the handle of his leather briefcase. He looked at Pierce with the quiet amusement of a predator watching a cornered animal exhaust itself. Alistair did not speak. He stood with his head bowed slightly, his broad shoulders rising and falling with each slow, deliberate breath. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic, heavy sound of the rain beginning to lash against the stained glass windows. Sloane took a step toward her father, her voice barely a whisper, asking him if it was true. She asked him if her mother had truly been murdered, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Before Alistair could answer, Vivienne finally found her voice, though it was no longer the smooth, aristocratic purr she used to dominate Manhattan society. It was a sharp, desperate screech as she ordered her son to get in the car, telling him they were leaving this ridiculous farce immediately. She stood up, her expensive silk gown rustling loudly, and tried to push past the guests in her row to reach the side exit. But Harrison stepped forward, his movement so smooth and precise it seemed almost effortless. He blocked her path, his voice calm, cold, and entirely unyielding as he informed her that she was not going anywhere. He told her that federal investigators and state police had already secured every exit of the estate. He told her that the flight plan for her private jet had been canceled 20 minutes ago on his authority. Vivienne took a step back, her heels clicking sharply against the marble, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal looking for an escape. She accused them of harassment, threatening to ruin Harrison's career and sue the Sterling Group for every penny they owned. But Harrison merely reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single laminated document. He told her that the warrant for her arrest had been signed by a federal judge at 9 o'clock that morning. He told her the charges included corporate fraud, grand larceny, and conspiracy to commit murder. The chapel erupted into a frenzy of hushed, terrified murmurs as the guests realized the true scale of the disaster unfolding before them. These were people who understood the delicate nature of power and reputation, and they could smell the absolute ruin of the Vance family. Pierce grabbed his mother's arm, his voice rising in pitch as he asked her what was happening, begging her to tell him that this was all a mistake. He looked at Sloane, his eyes wide with a pathetic, desperate pleading, asking her to stop this, promising that they could still make everything right. He told her he would marry her right now, that they didn't need the guests, that he would sign any prenuptial agreement her father wanted. Sloane looked at him, and for the first time, she felt a profound sense of disgust that completely washed away her pain. She told him to shut his mouth, her voice quiet but carrying a cold, razor-sharp edge that silenced him instantly. She turned her back on him, walking slowly toward Martha, who was still holding the small, rusted iron key. Sloane asked Martha what the key opened, her eyes fixed on the ancient piece of metal. Martha looked at Sloane with a mixture of pity and deep respect, telling her that the key belonged to a safety deposit box in a private vault in Manhattan. She said the box had been locked 25 years ago, on the night Caroline Sterling died. She said it contained the original, unaltered police reports, the forensic analysis of the car's braking system, and the original share certificates of the Sterling Group. Before Martha could explain further, the heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel groaned as they were pushed open from the outside. A cold, damp wind swept into the room, carrying the scent of wet pine and gasoline, extinguishing several of the tall white candles on the altar. The sound of heavy, idling engines echoed through the stone hall, a low, mechanical rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. 3 massive, black luxury SUVs had pulled up onto the gravel driveway, their headlights cutting through the dim afternoon light. A dozen men in dark suits and earpieces stepped out, quickly forming a protective corridor from the vehicles to the chapel entrance. And then, a figure emerged from the lead vehicle, walking slowly but with an absolute, terrifying authority. It was Eleanor Sterling. She was 82 years old, but she moved with the posture of a monarch. Her silver hair styled in a perfect, frozen bob that defied the wind. She wore a tailored, charcoal gray cashmere coat, and her hand gripped a cane topped with a solid platinum wolf's head. As she entered the chapel, the older guests in the pews instinctively stood up, a collective gesture of deep, generational respect. Eleanor was the true matriarch of the Sterling legacy, a woman who had ruled the family's international banking empire with an iron fist for 40 years. She walked down the center aisle, her cane striking the marble floor with a sharp, rhythmic click that sounded like a countdown. She did not look at the guests, nor did she look at the elaborate floral arrangements that had cost tens of thousands of dollars. Her eyes were fixed entirely on Sloane. When she reached the altar, she stopped, her gaze lingering on the simple, hand-altered vintage dress Sloane wore. A soft, sad smile touched the corners of her thin lips as she whispered that Caroline would have been so proud of her. She said the dress looked exactly as it did when Caroline wore it to her own debutante ball 40 years ago. Sloane looked at the older woman, her voice trembling as she asked if she was her grandmother. Eleanor nodded slowly, her eyes shining with a mixture of unshed tears and a cold can aglow de mai. Ancien Anger. She told Sloane that she had spent 25 years searching for her, believing that Alistair had taken her out of the country, or that she had met the same fate as her mother. She turned her gaze to Alistair, her expression hardening into a mask of severe accusation. She asked him how he could have hidden her granddaughter in a drafty cottage, letting her grow up, believing she was the daughter of a poor groundskeeper. She asked him how he could have let the Sterling bloodline live on the scraps of the very people who had destroyed their family. Alistair stepped forward, his voice cracking with a deep, agonizing pain as he looked at his mother. He told her that he had done it to keep Sloane alive. He said that 25 years ago, the Vance family was desperate, ruthless, and backed by some of the most dangerous political figures in the state. He said that if they had known Caroline had an heir who inherited her controlling shares, Sloane would never have made it to her 5th birthday. He said he had to make Sloane invisible, to strip her of the Sterling name and the Sterling wealth, so she could grow up without a target on her back. He looked at Sloane, his eyes filled with a desperate plea for forgiveness, telling her that every day of his life had been a torture of silence. He said he had watched her struggle, watched her worry about tuition fees and medical bills, while he sat on a fortune of over $2 billion. He said he had wanted to tell her 1,000 times, but every time he looked at her, he saw Caroline's face, and he remembered his promise to keep her safe at all costs. Sloane felt a tear finally slip down her cheek, but she did not brush it away. She asked him about her mother's death, demanding to know the exact truth of what happened in the Hamptons. Eleanor took a deep breath, her hand tightening on the platinum wolf's head of her cane. She told Sloane that 25 years ago, the Sterling Group was preparing for a massive public offering that would have solidified their control over the emerging tech and real estate sectors. Caroline had owned 45% of the voting shares, and she had planned to use that leverage to block the expansion of several predatory development projects. One of those projects was managed by Vivienne's brother-in-law, Charles Vance, a man who had borrowed heavily from international syndicates to fund his ambitions. If Caroline blocked the project, the Vance family would have been completely ruined, their assets liquidated, and their names dragged through the mud. So, Charles Vance took matters into his own hands. On a rainy Tuesday night in October, Caroline's vehicle was run off the road on a deserted stretch of highway in East Hampton. The local police department, which was heavily funded by Vance interests, ruled it a tragic accident caused by hydroplaning and excessive speed. But Eleanor said they had never believed the official story. She said that Vivienne, who was working as a senior corporate secretary for the firm handling the Sterling accounts, had used her position to access the vault. She had forged Caroline's signature on a series of stock transfer documents, effectively handing control of the shares to the Vance family. With those shares, the Vances built their current empire, launching the hedge funds and venture capital firms that Pierce now ran. They had built their entire dynasty on a foundation of blood, forgery, and theft. Sloane felt a cold, sickening realization wash over her. She looked at Vivienne, who was now leaning against the front pew, her face completely devoid of life, her hands trembling as she stared at the floor. Sloane realized that the very wealth Pierce had used to humiliate her, the very status he had used to call her a charity case, belonged to her mother. It was her mother's blood that had paid for Pierce's private schools, his luxury cars, his penthouses, and his high society lifestyle. She took a step toward Pierce, her voice incredibly calm, but carrying a weight that made him flinch. She asked him if he knew. She asked him if he had always known that his family's fortune was stolen from a dead woman. Pierce shook his head frantically, his voice a high, pathetic whine as he swore that he had no idea. He said he was just a child when it happened, that he only knew what his mother had told him about their investments. He looked at Vivienne, his voice cracking as he demanded that she say something, begging her to tell him that it wasn't true. But Vivienne remained silent, her eyes fixed on the shredded documents that Alistair had dropped on the marble floor. Harrison stepped forward, signaling to two of the plainclothes officers who had entered the chapel. He told Vivienne that her time was up. He said that the federal prosecutors had already frozen every bank account associated with the Vance Group, including Pierce's personal funds. He said that by tomorrow morning, the trading of their stock would be suspended pending a full SEC investigation. The officers approached Vivienne, their movements professional and efficient. As the metal handcuffs clicked around her wrists, the sound echoed through the silent chapel. A sharp, metallic period to the end of her dynasty. She did not look at her son, nor did she look at the guests who were now frantically texting their brokers on their phones. She was led down the aisle, her expensive couture gown dragging along the silk runner she had insisted on buying for the wedding. Pierce watched her go, his knees buckling as he realized the absolute finality of his ruin. He looked around the chapel, but the guests who had been smiling and nodding at his jokes an hour ago now looked away, refusing to make eye contact. In their world, there was nothing more contagious than failure, and the Vance family was now a biohazard. He looked at Sloane one last time, his mouth opening to speak, but no words came out. He was a ghost in his own life, stripped of his wealth, his status, and his future in a matter of minutes. Sloane did not watch him leave. She turned to her father, her eyes searching his face, looking for the man who had raised her. She saw the calloused hands, the tired eyes, the quiet strength that had always been her anchor. She realized that, even though he had lied to her, he had given up his entire life, his name, and his fortune, just to ensure she could grow up safe from the monsters in this room. She walked to him, her arms wrapping around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. Alistair held her tightly, his tears falling onto the delicate lace of Caroline's dress, his voice whispering over and over that he was so sorry. Sloane whispered back that she understood, that she knew he had done it out of love. But she told him that the hiding was over. She said they were going to take back what belonged to them, not to live in luxury, but to ensure that the truth was never buried again. The transition was not easy. In the months that followed, the financial world was rocked by the complete collapse of the Vance Group. The trial of Vivienne Vance and her associates became a national sensation, exposing the dark, corrupt underbelly of the ultra-wealthy elite. Pierce was left with nothing. His assets seized to pay off the massive debts and legal liabilities of his family's fraudulent empire. He was forced to leave Manhattan, disappearing into the obscurity he had spent his entire life trying to avoid. Sloane did not claim her inheritance to buy penthouses or designer clothes. She worked with Harrison and Eleanor to restructure the Sterling Group, turning it into a private foundation dedicated to corporate accountability and legal aid. She used her mother's fortune to establish a fund that provided top-tier legal representation to victims of corporate abuse and financial fraud. She remained in the Hudson Valley, but she no longer lived in the drafty cottage. She moved into the main estate, not as a spoiled heiress, but as a formidable force of change. She kept her mother's vintage dress in a glass case in her office, a daily reminder of where she came from and the price that had been paid for her freedom. Her relationship with Alistair grew stronger, built on a new foundation of absolute honesty. He no longer wore the faded canvas jacket, But he refused to adopt the expensive suits of the Manhattan elite. He remained a quiet, understated man, spending his days managing the estate's gardens and helping Sloane with the foundation's work. 1 year after the wedding that never was, Sloane returned to the Gothic chapel. The lilies were gone, replaced by simple, local wildflowers that filled the space with a light, natural fragrance. The heavy oak doors were open, letting in the warm, golden light of a late spring afternoon. Sloane was wearing a simple, elegant blue dress she had designed herself, her hair tied back in a neat, practical style. She stood near the altar, looking down at the marble floor where the Cartier ring had once rolled. She heard a soft footstep behind her and turned to see a young girl standing near the entrance. The girl was about 19 years old, wearing a faded denim jacket and holding a folder of documents against her chest. She looked nervous, her eyes darting around the massive, imposing space of the chapel. Sloane smiled, her voice warm and welcoming as she called her forward. The girl approached slowly, introducing herself as Clara, a student who had applied for the Foundation Scholarship Program. She said she was terrified of the interview, that she felt out of place among the wealthy trustees who would be deciding her future. She said she felt like she didn't belong in a world where everyone else seemed to have a pedigree and a legacy. Sloane walked down the altar steps, stopping in front of the young girl. She reached out, gently placing her hand on Clara's shoulder, her eyes shining with a deep, resolute strength. She told Clara that true power did not come from a name, a designer label, or a bank account. She said that true power was the resilience to survive the fire, to stand tall when everyone else expected you to fall. She told her that she belonged in any room she chose to enter, and that she would never have to apologize for where she came from. She led the young girl out of the chapel and into the warm afternoon sun, leaving the ghosts of the past behind them. As they walked down the gravel path, the sound of the chapel bell began to ring, its deep, resonant tone echoing across the valley. It was a sound of victory, of justice, and of a woman who had rewritten the rules of the game on her own terms. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story. See you next time.